Hey, in this last short lecture from chapter 5 in your textbook, we're going to talk about managing your emotions. So, when it comes to emotions, we generally group them into two types uh, when it comes to whether or not they're helpful to us as individuals. So, these two types are facilitative and debilitative emotions. Facilitative emotions contribute to effective functioning. They're the kinds of emotions that help us perform well at work, in relationships, in our hobbies, in our spare time, right? Facilitative emotions help us do what we want to do. Debilitative emotions detract from effective functioning. Excuse me. Debilitative emotions make it hard for us to perform well at school, at work, in our relationships, etc. And what's interesting is that the intensity, how strongly you feel an emotion, can influence whether or not it's facilitative or debilitative. So, for example, there's a difference between terror and fear. Fear can be a motivator. So you might be fearful of losing your job. So you work harder. You might be fearful of failing a course. So you study more, right? So fear can be a facilitative emotion. Can help you function more effectively. Terror, on the other hand, is a fear that's kind of paralyzing. That makes it so that you're unable to operate, right? You're unable to function effectively. And so as a result, this is debilitative, right? What's interesting is that duration also influences the quality of emotion. So we know, for example, that with rumination, dwelling persistently on negative thoughts, that this changes the quality of our emotion more generally, right? In a sense, you have to think about this. You have sort of an emotional baseline, a way that you just generally are, right? And how do I phrase this? So that baseline, right? If it's negative to begin with, it influences everything else that you do. So, for example, people who are depressed, clinically depressed, have chemical imbalances in their brain that make it so that they oftentimes do ruminate on issues. They dwell persistently on negative thoughts. And this constant negativity changes the quality of the negative emotion so that it's more harmful. It's more dangerous. It's more pernicious, to use a fancy word. And as a result, becomes more generally debilitative, right? As I indicated earlier, sometimes what might be commonly perceived as negative emotions, something like fear, could be facilitative. It can help you. Sometimes other negative emotions, like sadness, can help you too. Right? It can help you to be sad about something to affect positive change in your life. But if you constantly feel negative about something, then it makes it so that it becomes more and more difficult to function effectively. So the longer we influence, or the longer we experience an emotion, affects the quality of that emotion. So there are several sources of debilitative emotions, sources for emotions that make it hard to function. One is physiology. We know that our temperament, the way that we are, generally speaking, our affective status or emotional status is largely inherited. We know things like shyness, whether or not we're verbally aggressive, how assertive we are. All these elements are genetic, right? They're passed on to us. So we know there is just sort of a genetic physiological component to some debilitative emotions. We also know that some debilitative feelings lie in the amygdala, which is the part of the brain that triggers physiological reactions. So some people are just wired in such a way, well, everyone to some extent or another is wired in such a way, so that if a powerful emotion hits you, your amygdala fires up, and it causes the release of all kinds of hormones that can at times be debilitating, right? So if you've ever just been sort of paralyzed with fear, or you felt that you're so overwhelmed with adrenaline and with feelings, this whole experience of flooding, as we call it, when that occurs, at times that can be really debilitating. We can't deal with things effectively. Then of course, emotional memory also plays a role here, where sometimes seemingly harmless events can trigger very debilitative feelings, particularly if they bear resemblance to troublesome experiences that we've had already. This is one of the symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder, where we see people who might smell something or hear something that reminds them of a traumatic event that has happened in the past and ends up having kind of a paralyzing effect on them. And then finally, another source of debilitative emotions, and one that thankfully is fairly controllable, is self-talk. Now, when we're talking about self-talk, what we're really referencing here is the way that you think of things and the way that you think to yourself in your head, right? So when it comes to self-talk, we need to realize that events don't make us feel bad, right? Things aren't necessarily good or bad in and of themselves. It's the way we make sense of what happens to us that affects whether or not we think they're good or bad. Indeed, there's a lot of people out there, scientists, that suggest that the way emotions work, right, is that something happens to us, there's an event, then we consider the event, we think about it. What just happened to me? What's going on around me, right? And it's only then that we really figure out how we feel about that event, right? And so according to that equation, the event, thought, feeling equation, ultimately it's up to you to decide how you feel about things based on how you think about them. So I'll give you another example. When my mother later in life developed Parkinson's disease, which is a fatal neurological disorder. She used to tell me that one of the things that she learned was to choose to be happy, right? Like if I was mad or frustrated with something, she'd look at me and say, "Erik, choose to be happy," and it really used to make me mad, right? That's, saying something like that to someone, particularly when they're already angry, is sure probably to piss them off worse. But she had a point, right? And her point was that bad things happen to you, but it's up to you to decide how you feel about them, right? You can reassess, you can step back and say, okay, well, this is bad, but I can make the most of it. Or you could just sit around and say, oh my God, this is so bad, right? So ultimately, event, thought, feeling means that it's up to you to decide how you feel about things. Now, when it comes to irrational thinking, we engage in a lot of what are called fallacies, right? So fallacies are logically inconsistent ways of thinking, right? So their book has a whole list of fallacies that we engage in when it comes to making sense out of how we feel, right? So one of them, of course, is the fallacy of perfection, where we think that a good communicator should be able to handle every situation with confidence and skill. And we know for a fact that no one, right, can do this all the time. There's also the fallacy of approval, which is the idea that it's not just good, but really, really vital to get the approval of every single person. Again, we know that some people are just not going to like us, and that you're not going to get the approval of everyone, and we have to acknowledge that. Then there's the fallacy of shoulds, which is the inability to distinguish between what is and what should be, right? People who suffer from the fallacy of should say, well, yeah, it's this way, but it should be, right? Then there's the fallacy of overgeneralization, which people do all the time. And there's two types. That's a typo right there, my bad. There's two types of this. The first one is when we base a belief on a limited amount of evidence. So that's like, oh, I'm so dumb, I can't even figure out how to download music on my phone, right? Just because you can't download music to your phone doesn't mean that you're dumb, obviously. And then, of course, we exaggerate our shortcomings sometimes, right, and the shortcomings of others. So we can say something like, you never listen to me. And obviously people do. But by saying something like that, you're overstating what's happening. Then there's also the fallacy of causation, which is the irrational belief that emotions are caused by others rather than your own thinking. And this is, if there's a lesson to take away from this chapter on emotion, it's that ultimately it's up to you to decide how you feel, and that other people don't cause you to feel a certain way, right? Other people can do things that have an effect on you, but it's up to you to figure out how you feel about the things that other people do. Then there's the fallacy of helplessness, which is the idea that your whole life is determined by forces beyond your control. So a lot of people do this and see themselves as victims. They're plenty, oh, poor me, right? Like things never work out for me. Again, ultimately, you're responsible for your own feelings. And then the fallacy of catastrophic expectations. We all know these people, right? They're like Eeyore from Winnie the Pooh. They're people who walk around, if something bad can happen, it will. And of course, if you think bad things are going to happen, then they probably will. That's just part of self-fulfilling prophecy. If you think that you won't do well, you probably won't. If you think that people aren't going to like you, they probably won't, right? It's all about mindset, and it's all about controlling your own emotions. So, to minimize debilitative emotions, there are some things we can do. The first one is to monitor the way that we react, right? Recognize if you're experiencing a debilitative emotion. Recognize if the way you're feeling is keeping you from being constructive. Try and figure out what's causing this, right? What triggered your response? Was it a person? Was it a type of setting? Was it a particular place or situation? Was it a specific individual? If so, try and avoid them. Think about your own self-talk. Record your self-talk, right? If you have to, sit down and make write it out on paper. Make a list of how you feel. That can help you recognize some of your own feelings and whether or not they're debilitative or facilitative. And then, when you can, try and reappraise your irrational beliefs, right? Use your list of fallacies to identify why your thinking is illogical or irrational. And then try and think of a more rational way of dealing with your problems. So, in conclusion, to maximize your facilitative emotions, what you want to do is focus on the positive, choose to be happy, then enjoy your positive emotions when you do feel them, and when bad stuff happens to you, regard it as a challenge and a growth opportunity. Right? So I realize this sounds like happy, hippy-dippy self-talk, but there's a lot to this, and it's been proven time and again through scientific study that people who are able to adopt this kind of facilitative mindset when it comes to affect or emotion, they generally lead happier, more productive lives. All right, that's it for today, and that's it for this chapter. Thanks for tuning in.